I think we'll get the presentation underway tonight. And before we do start, I do want to have a big special thanks and a shout out to Sally, who you can see on your screen at the moment. Sally Williams, for those who don't know, is the secretary for the Melbourne to Osaka yacht race. And she's the one that's actually been working fairly hard behind the scenes to bring these presentations to you. So thank you, Sally. Absolutely brilliant. But joining us tonight, we will have two presentations, and we've got Marcel Varzon Morel, who is the principal of the Varzon Morel Solicitors. And not only is he a lawyer, but he's also a qualified shipwright, has spent 18 years in the boat building industry. And as a result of that, he wears two hats, one in the legal profession and also one as a passionate advocate for the marine industry and boating. He's had a number of articles published in marine magazines, and he's also received a number of awards for his maritime service, including being recognised by AIMEX, which is a peak body that represents the Australian maritime exports and the super yachts industry. So with that, Marcel's going to be talking tonight about insurance and salvage. So Marcel, if you can take control, and handing over to you, please.
Thanks, Grant. I feel very honoured and about being able to give this presentation. By the sounds of it, I heard some of the people coming in here, and they've got certainly a lot of experience with respect to travelling in their vessels around in different spaces. I suppose the purpose of this my slides, my talk tonight, is obviously not to provide every answer to every situation, but to give an overview and to give us some, I suppose, to provide a couple of really basic principles with respect to the questions of salvage and also the questions of insurance, and more importantly, to have I suppose, some practical applications and things to consider with respect to the salvage and insurance. So you can see there the content which we'll be covering in my presentation. And I think the first in the presentation, the first couple of slides in both insurance and also in salvage are going to be fairly quickly gone through. I don't want to bore everybody with too much legal ease as such. It's more the practical side of things that I like to get onto. So in terms of key principles, the question in salvage is just really a question of in the context of sailing vessels, which we're looking at, it refers to a recovery of the actual vessel itself. If there's cargo or contents within the vessels, then that would obviously be part of that, preventing any further damage. So that can be not just with respect to the actual vessel itself, but it could also be with respect to the environment where the vessel's sitting. And that sort of flows into the question there of protecting the environment. So that would be things like if the vessel's stranded on a reef, or if there are questions with respect to the bunkers or fuel tanks for others, in terms of releasing oil, diesel, those types of things. So they're sort of the types of considerations. I put in there recovery of sailors, and I think that's just a general principle, which probably, and I'm sure everybody here sort of understands it, but I've got to say it anyway, that it's just a general principle of seafarers, that if there is somebody at risk at sea, as a result of the bad weather or whatever is going on, the vessel's been stranded, whatever the situation is, that the first principle is to recover, is for the safety of human life. having said that, there's always a caveat with most things, and the caveat is that if the risk to actually recover that person is greater than, or puts the people with the salvors or the people at risk who are actually doing that, then that becomes a very difficult situation with respect to how they're going to recover that person without putting themselves or their crew or whoever of the salvors or the vessel that's going to be recovering that person, that they make sure that they don't put themselves in more risk than the person that's already there. Ultimately, it comes down to a question, that type of caveat. But in all intensive purposes, there is in most cases that that's that they go beyond whatever needs to happen in terms of recovery of the person. Just sort of briefly, there's its bottom line is as a legal, it's all a legal framework when it comes to salvage. There's laws, there's salvage agreements, it's contracts, it's all, that's what governs it. There's international conventions which are underline these contracts and form the principles of those agreements. There is, if we look at some of the underlying principles that exist within salvage, there's a duty to assist. So again, this comes down to the vessels and masters have a duty to render assistance to those in distress at sea without, and again comes back to that caveat, without endangering their own vessel, crew or passengers. So that's the principle in terms of a duty to assist. In terms of the reward criteria, one of the things that a lot of people think is that salvage is an automatic thing. Salvage is not automatic. It's controlled by contract. And there is a reward criteria, and it's a balancing between what the value is that can be ascertained from the salvage versus the actual cost of the salvage. So if the cost obviously outweighs it, then there's going to be no salvage. However, there are some areas which start to impinge on that idea of the reward criteria, and that is where you've got environmental concerns, and the other one is where there are special sort of considerations that have to be sort of taken into consideration in those circumstances. So that reward criteria are sort of, while it's the main factor, there are some underpinning issues that lie there. There is a principle in terms of no cure. In other words, the underlying factor is that if a salvor goes to, and this would have been part of their assessing the reward criteria, if the risk is too high in the sense of actually salvaging the vessel or actually being successful in the salvage of the vessel, then they will not get any, there'll be no payment for it, because in essence, you have to have a successful salvage in order for a payment to occur. There are some special circumstances in that, for argument's sake, if there's an environmental concern, then there will be a payment. In that case, there can be a case where if there's been an attempt, a salvor could be paid for their attempt. So there are some special sort of compensation, and there can be some additional payments to salvors for where there's danger, additional danger. And then finally, if it all goes wrong, the salvor decides that he's not going to salvage the vessel, and either the insurance company or whoever has employed the salvor doesn't agree with that there's going to be no salvage, then they can all go to arbitration and have that argument. and it's generally speaking governed by international arbitration groups which run these international arbitrations. So moving on to the practical considerations, I suppose some of the bottom line things which need to be considered with respect to salvage is it's not automatic. And that's one of the things I think is probably a really important point to understand. Another part to this is that it's the risk versus the reward. So in saying that it's automatic, it comes back to the question, a lot of that weight lies with the salvors in terms of their assessing whether they're going to undertake the salvage or not. It's not an easy area of law, and I understand there from talking to Grant that there are some people who are self-insuring, and in that case, it's a very complex interplay of legal and logistical and technical challenges which exist in this space. So it's worthwhile certainly getting somebody on board as potentially as a lawyer or somebody who can assist with that aspect of if you're going to be self-insuring. In terms of from the salvos perspective, yes, as I've said beforehand, the risk versus the reward. So that's a significant component to that. However, having said all of that, salvos are under an obligation, and their obligations are to stabilize situations, to minimize damage, and prevent environmental harm, as well as securing safety of lives. So they have a heavy obligation to honour those requirements. From an owner and insurer's perspective, similarly, there's, as there is with the salvors, there's this question of contract that's governed by a salvage agreement. It's important, if you are going to be a person who is going to be self-insuring, and for that matter, thereby is going to have to look at these particular types of agreements, these types of salvage agreements, it's worthwhile finding out in the marketplace who those people are going to be. You know what, roughly speaking, what your path is going to be, so you've got some idea of where those salvors are going to be coming from, whether it be Australia, potentially out, and potentially probably out of Singapore. So they're the types of things that you need to do, is start looking at those types of who it is that would be undertaking this thing, and get in touch with them, find out what their contracts and things like that are, and start that process. I think that's a really important thing to do if you're in that boat. If you're not in that boat and you're relying upon an insurance contract, then your insurer should be undertaking that process with respect to, and it's something that you can't take it for granted that you must be engaging with your insurance company to find out, well, okay, so you've got a salvage component, which is and in most cases, it's very, very basic insurance within the policy. So you want to get some detail of what it really looks like in terms of, okay, so we're going from Melbourne to Osaka, so what does your salvage policy look like with respect to an incident which occurs somewhere along that line? And at the end of the day, there is this concept of fair compensation for salvors, which comes back to the question of how much a salvor should be paid for the salvage that really flows into the question of commercial versus risk and the return. So salvers will not undertake a salvage if the return is going to be too low. That is in itself is then balanced up against the risk and all of the other factors that are there. So it's a complex equation which these guys are putting themselves through. There is a case study here which I've just put 3 examples up here, which I just wanted to have a little bit of a discussion about, just with respect to sort of understanding how those principles which I've spoken about play out in respect to the thinking which salvors may have in different situations. So there's the Costa Concordia that I'm sure everybody can remember. That was that vessel which I don't know how many people saw the interior of it, but it was gold lame from one end of the boat to the other. It was really well and truly over the top. There was the salvors had to the most significant point in this salvage, as far as I remember, was this question of environmental damage in terms of where it was situated. The bunkers were full of fuel. They were trying to ensure that the vessel didn't break up, and that the best way to recover the vessel. The other issues with that particular salvage came into play as the actual size of the vessel and the difficulties that were faced. Interestingly, on that particular vessel, because no lives were lost, and when I can remember seeing the footage of some of the crew, some of the people on board the boat, passengers departing the vessel, and I think the captain tried to, if I remember rightly, tried to sneak off the boat, which was looked upon pretty grimly in the media, and he, for all intents and purposes, he's well and truly in breach of the rules of the sea, in the sense that the captain is the last one that leaves the ship. In the next example there is Antarctica, and I know that you guys are not going down to Antarctica, but it's just an example of the types of balancing acts that the salvors have to face, and that's, in that situation, you've got deep sea location, specialized expertise, equipment, and probably in that space down there, you've got very, very high environmental concerns. So that is the sort of things which will be balanced up by everybody with respect to that particular area. In terms of, there is an example here of the Melbourne to Osaka, 2003. Actually, I had limited time to do much research on this one, but understand that the vessel had grounded off the reef in Papua New Guinea, and that it was a relatively complex rescue. I think, from what I read, the imperative, the most important part was the rescue of the sailors, but also there was a question to the environment with respect to the vessel sitting on the reef. So that was considered paramount in that situation. So I suppose in closing, there's two main aspects that I can gather in this situation. Is you've got some people who are going to be self-insuring, and you've got some people who are going to be looking at insurance, having insurance policies which are very, very limited, and need to be considered in themselves as far as those particular documents. So I'll move on to the insurance question, and we'll look at some basic principles here with respect to understanding insurance. First and foremost, there's hull insurance, which is relatively straightforward. This is damage to the vessel itself caused by accidents, collisions, natural perils, such as storms and groundings. Then you've got the liability. Oh, I'll go back here. Sorry about that. Then you've got the liability, which is the third-party liability. In other words, this is to cover other people or boats or damage to others that has occurred. And then you've got the cargo, which doesn't really apply in the sense of these vessels, but you do carry things within the vessel. And then you've got the personal accident, which is the insurance with respect to injury and death to crew members and passengers. So typically speaking, there's all of this then ends up in two agreements. There's the third party liability, which is the base principle or base policy, which is being expected in as I understand it in the race. And then your typical insurance, which you get from an insurer, which covers all those things: hull, cargo, and personal accident, which is included in those policies. So those policies, which we see as marine insurance policies for vessels, include all of those basic principles that I've spoken about here. It's important to understand what the key issues are with respect to your policy. And that is understanding that the policy covers the navigational limits. So the policy you cannot be assumed that your policy covers the limits or covers the areas which you're seeking. You need to speak to your insurer to ensure that it actually covers the track. It's worthwhile having this discussion. And before I go any further, it's important to have this discussion in email, so that there is a paper track which can be followed back in the event that there is a problem in the future. In terms of the risk assessment is a huge problem within and risk assessment and underwriting is a huge area, a huge problem within insurance, and also difficult. And it's also difficult with respect to boat owners. And the reason why I say this is because it comes down to the simple word of seaworthiness. That single word has probably made more money for lawyers than you could actually poke a stick at. The insurance companies will look for every excuse they can possibly find in order to get out of a policy. We've had situations where people have gone and worked on an engine themselves, or have done the plumbing in a boat themselves, or have done some worked by the boat themselves, even if they are qualified, and it has come back to haunt the owner of the vessel because the insurance company have turned around and said, well, your boat sunk, or this occurred because you didn't have a professional do the work, so we can't actually guarantee that the work was done correctly, or that they used marine quality parts, or all of this sort of stuff. So the insurance companies will look for whatever excuse they can find in order to be able to say that the vessel was not seaworthy. Electrics is a classic on that one, especially where there's such an easy thing to do. I'll just go and wire that up. Well, the insurance companies, the problem happens, the boat burns down, and the company then starts looking for, why did it burn down? And then they say, well, who did the electrics? And it comes down to this point of saying, well, because the electrics was done by you, there's a problem with that. Liability coverage is a or the coverage of unforeseen events. That's something which needs to be addressed with respect to. It can be a case that you can actually go to the insurer and say to them, look, this is what I'm planning on doing with respect to the plotting the charts. We're limiting things because we're going to be going at a particular time of year. We've done all of these things, all of this planning, and so can you please take this into consideration? In terms of liability coverage, that's a really important one in terms of covering legal expenses and damages arising from accidents or injuries caused by others. Legal expenses is a big one in the sense that insurance policies don't necessarily cover all of the expenses. I should say that the legals aren't necessarily all covered. It's covered in respect to a third party claim, but not necessarily in respect to the insurers claiming, the party claiming against the actual insurance company. That's not actually covered. And then the regulatory compliance, the final one there, is just more about ensuring that the policies are in line with those countries that you're traveling through. It's in line with, so in other words, in terms of international borders and all those types of things. So the practical...
Marcel, just before we move on there, we've had a question, if we just maybe go back one slide,
sure.
From Kevin, and he's just asking, can you please comment on the liability when accepting a tow? This seems to be the most common occurrence. I suppose that probably comes down to two parts. One would be, part one is if the boat is damaged but when they're under tow, and two, if it's a salvage, does a towing boat have the right to claim the boat itself?
There's in essence, I'll deal with the second part of that question. Is a vessel under tow, or any form of the ownership of that vessel always remains with the owner of the vessel. The ownership of the vessel doesn't transfer just because the vessel's being towed. So, for argument's sake, if a vessel was abandoned, and then somebody goes out and tows that vessel, they don't have a right of ownership over that vessel. The vessel still remains with the owner, the original owner. That's the first part of that one. In terms of the second part, which is the question of under tow, well, that sort of basically falls under the question of salvage, and it really comes back to what the agreement is between the parties. So if somebody rolls up, so that this is where the balancing act comes up, that there's first and foremost is an obligation for, if a boat comes along and says, okay, we need to give you a tow, and there's imminent danger, for instance, you're on a lee shore, then there is an obligation by that vessel to tow that vessel. If there's no pre-existing agreement that is in place, then it comes, and the vessel's towed to safety and all the rest of it, then it comes down to a question of the concept of fair and reasonable compensation for the tow. So these are the types of principles which come into play in that situation, even if, because they're not it's not like some sort of agreement has been agreed to, like between an insurance and a salvor. You're out there, there's a vessel near you, for all intensive purposes, there is an obligation to provide assistance to that boat that's in distress. So that's the first and foremost principle that applies. However, whatever happens after that in terms of agreements and things, well, that really comes down to the parties, how they're going to sit down and navigate what that agreement looks like and who's going to pay what and all the rest of it.
Excellent. Thanks, Marcel. I know that one's raised its head a few times, and we've always had that question about ownership, so that clears it up. So thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. In terms of the practical side of things, in terms of the insurance policy, we've touched on that it must include the navigational limits. In other words, one of the good things you've got here is we've got a defined race between Melbourne and Osaka, so we know that to start with. What the pathway will be is going to be really something which you guys are going to have to consider, and potentially, if you've got an insurer, is to go with them and explain that to them. It's quite a different position to general cruising. We've got I've just done a settlement on a Nordhaven in Amsterdam. Vessel was registered initially with American flagging. They then transferred it to AMSA. They were initially told when they purchased the vessel by their insurance company that they would be covered by the Nordhaven internal insurance people. Once those people found out they were transferring the flagging to Australian flagging, Nordhaven told them they would no longer insure them and that they would have to find their own insurance. It's become increasingly difficult Australia's on the nose when it comes to insurance, basically because of all of the cyclones and things that the inclement weather we get down here. We can blame Queensland for it because they've basically tainted the whole of Australia with the problems in terms of getting insurance. In terms of assessment of the vessels, that question of seaworthiness, I can't stipulate enough how important that is. It is so important that your vessel is, if you've got an insurer, that you have the vessel surveyed for insurance purposes. You might get an engineer on board who looks at the engines to make sure that they're up to scratch, to get the electrics checked, and the fourth one, which I would be doing, would be to get an inspection of the rig and present those to the insurer so that for them to see that all of these things are of a seaworthy caliber and that they can't turn around and say, oh, your rig was X and all the rest of it. The insurers are quick, as I said before, right at the beginning, they're quick to insure. So we often find that it's pretty regular. The insurers will take on board the boat, take the money, and when there's a problem, they then turn around and blame the owner of the vessel for the fact that the vessel's not in seaworthy condition. So if you take that control and then give it to the insurance, then they've got no issue that they can't come back at you. Well, there's a good chance, I can't say can't, there's a good chance that they won't come back and blame the owner of the vessel. What's going to go against in terms of what's difficult in this situation is that you've only got two crew on the vessel. That means you really need to go to your insurer with all of the evidence with respect to what courses, what experience, all the rest of it you've got under the belt, to show the insurer that we've got two really highly experienced people who are racing on this. They've got all of the international certificates, blah blah blah, in order to minimize any ability by the insurance companies to come back and make some sort of claim or stop some sort of claim with respect to that. Weather patterns that can be planned, it can be brought to the attention of the insurer. Look, there's always going to be unforeseen events and storms and things. You can only plan as best as you possibly can. It's important to ensure that you have got your legal expenses and find out what is being covered in those policies, and also if those policies are also in line with the conventions and countries of law and of those different the laws of those different countries. Your insurer should be looking after all of this, and that's the beauty of doing that. Now, I understand that there's been a lot of difficulty, and as stated beforehand, in terms of finding policies, insurance policies for the vessels. one point on that is that if you've got an insurer who is based here in Australia, there's a good chance that they will have signed up to an agreement with AFCA, which is the financial body which allows a cheap way of being able to have a disagreement with your insurer. And if the agreement comes down on your side, the insurance company is automatically bound by it. If it doesn't come down on your side, the owner of the vessel is still free to go and pursue it in another jurisdiction to try and get an outcome. If you've got an insurer outside of Australia, they most likely will have not signed up to AFCA, and you will be stuck in their jurisdiction, which could be England or wherever, in order to fight them for not paying the claim, and you're also stuck with all of those incidental expenses, travel, hotels, everything else that rolls with that. So that pretty well completes my presentation. So thank you very much for the chance to be able to speak with everybody.
We might just, Marcel, if anybody would like to ask some questions, and you don't want to type that out, if you'd maybe like to unmute yourself and ask some questions on that.
It's George Grant.
Yes, George.
Marcel.
Yeah.
About 2 years ago, I think it was after a Sydney-Hobart race, there was a yacht that was abandoned and ended up on Cape Barren Island. And I understand there was a dispute between the native title holders to the island and the insurance company, and I haven't heard who came out on top.
Yes, I remember this one. This was actually put as a question to me by somebody. I've forgotten who it was now. I don't remember everything. I think the issue there was that I think the issue was that that the vessel was salvaged, if I remember rightly, and the question then came down to that the salvors had not sought hadn't spoken with the landowners in order to be able to get access to the vessel. So that I think that's how that one rolled, if I remember rightly. But I think it was salvaged. So that's yeah.
Yeah, I wonder whether this is going to be a growing problem in Australia, especially because of our growing number of native title areas.
Look, my experience with that sort of thing is that the native title or the people are pragmatic in the sense that it's just a matter of asking permission, in the sense of, can I come onto your land? Yeah, sure, there's a problem here, and it would naturally be granted. It's the issue is, I think the issue is more about not asking and just assuming. I think that's more the question. It's not a case that they are wanting to stand in the way. It's a case of just respect.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, George. Marcel, I know when we talked a little bit earlier, you mentioned that you've got some contacts that might be able to help people if they're having trouble getting insurance. And just also on that point, just to clarify, when Marcel and I were talking, I was talking to Marcel about some boats self-insuring. Just to clarify, what I was referring to there was that they was self-insuring the hull. Under the notice of race, they're still required to have the 10 million legal liability insurance, and that would also have to although it's not written, it would have to include things like salvage, etc., in that contract. But if you could just explain maybe your contacts or how you might be able to help people in that area with regards to insurance.
Sure. I think that's one of the things about work. I've been in this space now for 18 years now. The practice is coming up to, or is 18 years old. Actually, on that point, I think that you mentioned before being a shipwright. I think I was actually in the industry for 30 years, but there's this thing where people say to me, "Oh, you're a shipwright," and you go, "Oh, I used to be," and then I go, "Hang on a minute, I still am," because once you're a shipwright, you're always a shipwright. Whereas when you're a lawyer, you're not necessarily always a lawyer. In terms of the insurance broker, Benjamin and Benjamin are is a company which Paul Benjamin's the director of that, owner of that company. They deal in special in the maritime, specialize themselves in maritime. What they do is they have as a form that you fill out, which provides all the information to them around, which then allows them to go out to the marketplace and find who the best people are to use in that, as far as insurers and underwriters and all the rest of it. So that takes for all intensive purposes, it takes out all of the hard work that you have to do in terms of knocking on people's doors and things like that. I've used them across. I've known, just for full disclosure, I've known Paul for 15 years. He's and he is a close, has become a very close friend. But I have always found him incredibly honourable with respect to his work and things like that. It's a very successful firm, and they really do an excellent job there. So that's, I would, I'm sure there's a lot of other people out there in the marketplace, but he was one of the people who, there was him, Petanius, Club Marine. I think they were the three that would come up to Sanctuary Cove, up to the super yacht conference up there, and presented themselves as in that space. And so, and often that Paul has come back to us with that we've ended up using Petanius for certain circumstances, and then other insurances for other insurers for other situations. So that's, and he also, the benefit of that is that you also get, he is on board with respect to ensuring that the contract, or the insurance contract, meets the requirements that you're seeking. So there is an obligation it shifts the obligation to his head, or his firm's head, to make sure that speaks to your needs.
We just got one inquiry there from Cyrus, just wondering if you could just clarify, Benjamin and Benjamin brokers, direct insurers, what's their role?
So that there's no fee paid to them directly. So that's the other thing I should have mentioned there. Their role is literally just an insurance broker. They go they go out to the market with what you want, and they act as I suppose the intermediary or the broker in between yourself and all of the different insurance companies out there. And what they do is they'll come back to you with a list of different insurers and different costs and things like that, and then you just make the choice as to what you want. You can have that discussion with them.
Excellent. Well, we're getting a few comments there saying, thanks, Marcel, great advice. So again, thank you for taking the time tonight to present that information. And if it's okay with you, if people want to get in contact with Benjamin, maybe if I can pass your details on to them, and then you can refer them on from there.
Oh, most definitely. If you've got I think you've got my mobile number. I'm more than happy to for people to have my mobile number too. Not that you want to necessarily contact me, but you can stick it in I'm in WhatsApp. So it might be a case that that call might be something that needs to happen, and the number's there if people need it.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you, Marcel, for taking the time to share that information with you. It certainly clarified in my mind a couple of those things that we had heard as more like wise tales, and so you've clarified those, and now we can sort of speak with confidence on some of those issues. So thank you very much for that.
No problem. Thank you for the option.
Excellent. All right. So moving on now to our second presenter, Robin Brooke, who most of you in Melbourne will already know, but those in Japan and overseas may not. Robin has done a Melbourne to Osaka yacht race, and she's got some quite interesting stories to tell on their journey up, and also what they did on the way back. She's also been a participant of 3 Vanuatu races, sailed from Germany to the West Indies, and there's another whole story in that as well. Spent time in the Caribbean, and although we won't have time to cover it tonight, she checked out of Australia with customs, Border Force, and proceeded north. This was back in her youth, and managed to get shipwrecked north of Cairns, only to have to turn around and make their way back to Australia to recheck back in. So I couldn't think of anyone more qualified to talk about the protocols of getting in and out of Australia and around the customs. So handing over to you, Robin.
Well, thank you, Grant. It was quite a while ago, so I think things might have changed somewhat since I was last there. Let me just take control of this beast here. And see if I can make it work. Oh, here we go. So tonight, I don't actually hate doing these presentations because it reminds me so much of how much I miss being out there and preparing for these wonderful long distance races. Because I started sailing on the ocean, when I came back to Melbourne, it wasn't really an option here. You had to join a yacht club because it's so far from the heads, so far from any part of the ocean. It takes too long to get there in a weekend. And so I was lucky enough to meet George, and he wanted to do this big race, the Melbourne to Osaka. I remember it was one off season, and he said, do you want to go cruising in the Pacific, or do you want to go racing to Japan? And I thought, oh, rather go racing to Japan than cruising in the Pacific with you, George. But that was in the early days, and we've done a lot of sailing together since then. So tonight, actually, I'm talking about flags and international protocols. And I found it quite difficult to get information about international protocols that wasn't consistent. There seemed to be a lot of information out there, but not all of it was agreeing with the other. So we'll work through it, and I'd be very grateful if, I know that Grant has done a lot. Grant Joker by 2 has done a lot of work so far. So feel free, Grant and everybody else, to chip in and correct me if I'm wrong, where I'm wrong. I'm sure I am in places, and give me another point of view as well. So you're all welcome. Even though I'm drinking my coffee out of a cup that says, please don't interrupt you when I'm ignoring you. So let us move on because we haven't got that long. So flags. We all know that the Australian national flag is blue, and there's a red flag that a lot of boats seem to fly. The red ensign was designed to be flown at sea by our commercial shipping fleet. Because our commercial, I'm not sure if it's because of, but our commercial shipping fleet has decreased somewhat, and it's now a legal requirement under international maritime law for yachts to display the Australian red ensign. Although there is a rider on that, like I said, there's no hard and fast rule to a lot of these things. If you don't have a red one, you can fly a blue one, is what I read as well. It's now, it does say that ships have to fly it all the time, but on other websites it does say that in good weather, it says when you're in a foreign port, well, that's a given, and also when passing a naval vessel, and some other documents say when passing a ship. So it could be when you're passing, it would be probably a nice thing to do if you are passing a ship on the way to Osaka. You won't see many until you get to the Kuroshio Current, but when you are passing a ship, to pop your ensign out so that they can see that you're an Australian registered vessel. Have I got that right so far? Hope so. Where do you fly it? So the national ensign is given the most senior position, which on a yacht is from the flagstaff at the stern. Not every racing yacht has a stern flagstaff, so then you could either fly it from the bow, which would be quite unusual, or you would have a flag halyard and you could fly it from there. But if you do fly it from there, it needs to be above any other flag and not on the same flagstaff as any other country flag. The Q flag. When you come into a new port, you need to request pratique. Pratique is the license or permission to use a port from the host country. So it's not you're asking for a practical health check, although most people think it is. You're actually saying when you're flying a Q flag that you are healthy and you're requesting to enter the port, permission to enter the port. It's the first flag that you raise when you come into a foreign port. It tells the port authorities that your ship's healthy and you require free pratique, as I said. And after clearing, the Q flag is then replaced by the courtesy flag. Although now it's common custom to put your courtesy flag up, which is the host country that you're visiting, and the Q flag underneath, and then just remove the Q flag once that work is done. It's a polite custom, not a legal requirement to fly the courtesy flag, and it's centuries-old tradition, so it is a good idea to do it. It's a sign of respect. But, as I said, the only legal requirement for vessels in foreign water is to fly the red ensign flag, or a blue one if you don't have one. The courtesy flag is flown at the starboard spreader from the forwardmost mast. It's very, very difficult to get photos of this on the web. I did find a lot of yachts that had that were three-masted and they were flying it from the stern mast. So there's a lot of mistakes out there. It should be flown at the top of the halyard, of course, not at half-mast. And it's, as I said, it's hoisted after the authorities have granted your vessel clearance to enter the port. Never fly the national ensign and courtesy flag on the same mast. That's sort of an indication that you might want to fight. Keep your flags in good condition out of respect. Rules and traditions may vary from one country to another, and the website Noonsite is a good reference for you to go to if you wanted to check that these are the standard rules for the country that you might be entering on your way home. And if you have international guests on board, it's always a good idea to fly their flag, ask them to bring it with them, but never on the same side again as the country you are visiting for the same reasons I mentioned before. When you go into port, when you're cruising, like when we were in the Caribbean, it was always the first thing you noticed when you went into a port. You checked out to see if there were any Australian flags flying, either crew members, and you would see that on the port side as they would have their guest flag flying, or obviously the vessel would have been registered. And they'd have their ensign at the back. So that's pretty much it. Are there any questions about where to fly your flags? It's a good idea to take the flags with you that you think, for the countries you think you might be visiting. These are the countries that you're going to sail through on your way to Japan, Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomons. There's quite a few. You won't be going out as far, I wouldn't think, as New Caledonia, but you never know. So the first countries that you're going to go through are Solomons and Papua New Guinea. So their flags are quite difficult to make, I would imagine, unless you want to take some white stars with you. You could make them on board while you're on watch, while you're on a slow watch, if you wanted to, or just buy them. So the Solomon Islands, those 5 stars are for the 5 main islands. They have had more islands added to the Solomons since then, but they haven't changed their flag. And then you've got the Bird of Paradise up there on the Papua New Guinea flag. You go through Micronesia, the Federated States of Micronesia. Each of those stars represents one of the islands. I can't remember, Ponape is one. Can't quite remember the names of the others. Chuuk is one, I think, or is Chuuk the Upsjat? Does anybody know those other 4 in Micronesia? We stopped in Micronesia on the way up. I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. The island of Guam. Guam is part of America. It's the site, the naval site, and the army is there as well. But they do have their own flag as well, the Guam flag. Whether you choose to, you're going to go in there, you're going to need a visa to get in there, an American visa. That's a bit of a process to get that. I wouldn't recommend you go into any American illegal immigration where the immigration law is that of the US without having a visa. So once you get through Guam and the islands, you haven't got too far to go. You've only got 2,542 kilometres. It always, well, I don't know about you, Grant, but once you got through that archipelago there and to the inside, it sort of felt like you're on the home stretch.
Yes, you're in the trade winds, and it was a lovely run going up. And it was you got out of the heat and into the nice mild climates.
Yeah, and this flag of the Northern Marianas, of course, you wouldn't want to be trying to make that up on the boat.
Yeah, and Robin, you mentioned that getting a visa going into Guam and Saipan, which are American protectorates.
Yep.
Just for the clarification, they actually need to be a full visa and not an ESTA, which means getting the full visa means taking a visit to the consulate to get that if you were going to call in.
Yes, it's a bit of a process. It's all written up on Noonside. Again, I'll get to Noonside in a minute, but it is a bit of a process if you're going to go into America. But of course, if you've got a Mayday situation or, a serious situation on the boat and Guam's there or Saipan's there, you're not going to not go in. I was reading on some of the blogs that there was one where they came across some refugees on a boat, and this happened 3 times to this particular yacht. They were sailing in the South Mediterranean, and they tried calling the Coast Guard and with no response. But as soon as they called a pan, they got an immediate response. So just keep that under your hat in case there is some, and somebody might be able to correct me here, but maybe there is some legal framework that makes an obligation for the authorities to respond in a pan situation, whereas the Coast Guard is not sort of covered by that sort of ruling. I'm not sure. Yeah, this is a beautiful flag. It's a very, very unusual one. It's a mixture of obviously all these blue flags are because of the Pacific Ocean, and the star symbolises the islands and the Commonwealth. The stone in the middle represents the Chamorro culture, which is the original culture of the area, and the circular head wreath made from the 4 flowers represents the Caroline people from the Caroline Islands. It's quite an unusual flag, very identifiable. And then, of course, I suggest you carry one of these on the boat. You could make one, quite easy to make. But yeah, a Japanese flag, obviously, when you come to Japan, is a no-brainer. Hopefully, you won't be needing these. Does anybody know what flags these are? Well, this one I mentioned, the French tricolour. The one on the left is Palau, and the one on the right, I was wondering if perhaps on the way home, if you did visit New Caledonia, whether the flag had changed, because that's the Kanak flag of New Caledonia. I know that when we did the race many years ago, there were certain things that happened during the course of the race that we were surprised to hear had happened when we got to Japan. One of them was the SARS virus came and went. They asked us if with Customs and Immigration, whether we were healthy and whether we had SARS. And the other thing that happened, there was the Iraq War happened. It started and finished during the time that we were at sea. So you never know. You might have a different flag in Newcal. So you need to be prepared. Here's us. We stopped over at Chesterfield Reef, and I became a little bit paranoid that the French authorities were going to come in there and we didn't have a French flag. So I got some garbage bags, and chopped them up in red, white and blue and stitched them together at Chesterfield, just so they wouldn't look on us unkindly if they did happen to be in there and we found out that we didn't have permission to stop. Beautiful place. Stop there if you can on the way back. It's a long way out of your way, but it's worth it. So leaving Melbourne, that's enough for the flags. Has anyone got any question on flags? Sal, anything in the chat on flags?
So we do have one question about if you don't have a particular island flag and visit, are there any issues?
Well, probably the price you'll pay for one when you get there. That's about it. You'll be able to buy one there. No, there are no issues. But, you would mention that to the authorities when they came and excuse yourself and apologise that, it wasn't on your plan to come in and that where could you buy one? That's, I'm sure that if you gave them, a bit of graft, they would deliver it to your boat for you. So moving on to protocols, there's no more questions on flags. Leaving Melbourne, Customs and Immigration will come to SYC and possibly other clubs by arrangement to check the boats out. It's not immigration, is it? It's Border Force. Yeah, they'll come down and check you out and check over your boats prior to the start date. There is a presentation scheduled for the 4th of September, so they will cover all of that in detail. I've just put a little note in there, though, that if you haven't done it yet, you're running out of time. Make sure that your vessel is registered before you leave Australia. State registration does not meet this requirement. And you're not covered by, there's some insurance, maybe, Marcel, you'll know this, you're not covered by some sort of insurance, by any diplomatic support if your ship is not registered. And this is done through the AMSA site. So anyone who's yet to do it, who needs a hand, just let Sally know. If you need a hand, we're here to help. Passports, make sure your passport, and just did this, good on you, Chipper. I thought you'd be well on top of that one. Passports, make sure your passports and those of your return crew are valid for at least 12 months. Before you sail, longer if you're planning to stay away a bit longer. Return crew, before you sail, provide a letter to any crew who are joining you for any part of the return trip. Because if they're to join you in Saipan, wherever, a one-way ticket to some countries is not acceptable. They may expect you to show that you have the wealth to be able to afford a ticket, but most countries will expect you to have a return ticket. And if you have a letter from the skipper, that this was a problem in Vanuatu, actually. It took us a little bit of work to get this happening. So we do have a template letter. And I'm sure that we'll make it available on the website for you if you wanted to download that, or just ask us and we'll send you a copy if you'd like us to help you with the wording. It's a pretty simple letter, but it's just telling you that you take responsibility for them because they're joining your yacht for the return trip. And for more information about all of this, is what I said, it's Noon site for relevant information about any country that you're planning to visit. Arriving in Japan. So I found this fabulous picture. It's an old one, but this is Yumeshima Island. And you can see here on the left-hand side where the wall is. So this is going to be home for a little while for you when you get to Japan. So the boats will come into behind the wall, and I'll get my little pointer. Where is it? Here, just along here. And George has recently, am I allowed to say this, George? Too late. Has got a little pontoon that's going in over here, and there's going to be a ferry, a little ferry just for us to take family, friends and competitors to and from this island, which is Mishima Island. And along here is the campground where there are cabins and caravans on site that you can hire. There's a big outdoor entertaining area, like a big barbecue area that will probably have some functions in. And it's probably, we're not sure where that pontoon's going to go, but we might have to get some bicycles and make sure we've got transport to and from there. So it's all starting to come together. The island doesn't look anything like that. like what it is now. It's I think a lot of this area has been filled in. This was a waste recycle area, so I'm certainly hoping it's not still a waste recycle area by the time we get there. Otherwise, it'll be pretty unpleasant if in a southerly. So when we arrive in Japan, as I mentioned, a temporary marina on the island of Yumeshima is being established for arriving yachts. Customs and immigration officials have indicated a willingness to check the boats in at Yumeshima. In the past, we've had to go into town, into Osaka, which is a fair hike. I think you can just about see over the back here is the city of Osaka. Yeah, so it's a fair hike to get in there to do your customs and immigration clearance. So that would be a real coup if we could get that, and possibly because there's so much activity on Yumeshima with the World Expo happening, it's possible that they'll have an area there for customs and for border force or whatever they choose to call theirs. If you want to cruise when you get in there, there is a closed port permit that yachts can get for visiting around Japan, and it's valid for as long as the boat is in Japan and as long as the ownership doesn't change. So you apply for that by email and it takes about a week to process. And what the best thing is, there's no cost. You can ask on entry to Japan to be registered also as a domestic coastal cruising boat, which is a Naiko, I can't quite read that, Senpaku, or a Naikozen, and that will help you to avoid potential onerous customs requirements. I read one story where there was an issue around somebody taking a can of Coke out of their stores on board, that the customs officials saw that as being a big problem. So it might be a good idea to look at this, and we'll look into it further for the group to see if we can perhaps facilitate this and make it happen automatically when you come in. So more on that now that I know that that exists. We didn't need one all that time back, but it sounds like it's better to tick these boxes rather than leave it to chance, I think. The other thing on that is that we're still hoping to bring a container over to Japan with cruising gear for all the yachts, so they can put their dinghies and their outboards and things in there and their cruising sails. So if that happens, there might be an opportunity to bring some nice Australian wine, or ship stores as we call them, and into the container. And if that's the case, then this will be really important, this permit. So drug control in Japan, yeah, this was a big one. We had to relinquish our first aid kits. They were all locked away. All our hard drugs, as you call them, were all locked away in customs, and then we had to arrange to get them back before we left. So if you're not leaving from the same port that you're arriving from Osaka, then it would be a bit of a nightmare. So I'm not sure what the plan will be this time, all these years on, but they are still extremely strict about drug control. Anything with codeine in it, some cough mixtures, anything with pseudoephedrine, they're all illegal in Japan. Medical marijuana is illegal. So you may be asked to relinquish your items in your medical kit until you check out. So just keep that in mind and maybe separate them from your first aid kit and put them in a secure lock box, so that it makes it much more easy if you do have to hand those over. It's also probably a good safety measure for when you're out checking out Osaka and other places off the boat. Any advice when re-medicines for return trip? Advice as in, would you like to ask that question? Sorry.
Oh, specifically, Robin, if you have to get rid of codeine and some of these other things, when you're leaving Japan, are you able to either restock on them, or do you do something else?
Oh, they give them back to you when you leave.
Oh, good. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, unless you're leaving from another port, of course, and you can't be bothered going back. It's not worth your while to come back to get them. But you talk to them, and yeah, they gave ours back, all of ours back. They may not have been in date by the time we left, but they gave them back.
In the last race, Robin, they actually came on board the boat and put a sticker over the cabinet that had the drugs in it. We had morphine in ours, and they seemed to be quite comfortable with that.
Oh, that's good.
But having said that, from your experience to my experience, the group going this time could have a completely different experience. So the advice you're giving is still relevant. Keep them separated in a box.
Yeah, or you have even a cupboard. We've got a cupboard on the sec, and it's got a key lock, so you can have it in a box, locked cupboard as well. They might be happy with that if you give them the key. Maybe I'm not sure.
Oh, the
But
sticker they put on actually, when you pull the sticker off, it leaves a residue behind. So it's actually impossible to get the sticker off without damaging it. And that's how they know that you haven't opened that cupboard.
Oh, right, okay.
But that
Yeah,
could all change. That could all change over the last
could all
6
change.
years now.
And if we do have the guys coming down to the boats and they're the same people, if they know the drill and we know the drill, we might be able to negotiate with them beforehand to say, how would you like us to handle this? And we will let the boats know how to manage the storage of their medications on the way. So it's easier. So anyway, more on that, I suppose. But just for your interest, if we aren't able to get any agreement on how we're to manage the bigger drugs, the illegal drugs, just keep that in mind that it might be a good idea to have that secure lockable area or box. So that brings me to Noonsite. Noonsite is where you will get a plethora of information. It is you can register for free, but it's a bit awkward. You have to give your credit card details anyway. And you're only allowed to, if you have the free version, you can only view 3 country formalities per month, which makes it a bit difficult. For $2.99 a month, which is, I'm assuming this is US dollars because it's a .com, that gets you unlimited formality views per month. And for $6.99 a month, for the gold version, that gets you offline access for up to 10 ports per month and 10 formalities per month, which might be a really good thing to have for your return cruise, to actually have access to that and be able to download that information for those that string of islands that you're going to be visiting in the next 3 or 4 days or weeks or months or whatever. Yes, so I think that's just about all I had, except I found this on the web today, and it's an ad for Expo 2025. And up in that right corner, it says that it's 277 days to go. So that doesn't sound like much. So I'm assuming that's a little bit less for the race start. Do we have a countdown on our website yet? Do we know how many days till the first start, George? And the other reason I put this on is to remind you that for friends and family, it might be a good idea to start going in and having a look at what's on at the expo, because I'm sure that a lot of things are going to be sold out quite quickly. And that's it from me, unless there's any questions. The next date is the medical wellbeing and the journey home. I think Annette's doing that one. Soph, is Annette doing that one? On the 7th of August. And then on the 4th of September, as I mentioned, the Border Force Aquas, AMSA. On the 7th of October, provisioning and clean oceans. I think Lil's doing clean oceans. And on next year, in person, there's 2 in-person meetings, the medical, practical and dental emergencies and the sail repair and rigging repairs. So that's what's coming up in the next few months. How's everyone going with their prep? Should be just about there by now.
Robin, can I just talk about the pan thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
What have you found?
Well, from what I understand is if you go Mayday, that's critical. That's life or death.
That's right.
And if you go pan, it's like it's basically it's a little bit sort of under that in terms they've got to sort of drop what they're doing and sort of think about what they're going to do next. But it doesn't I think it's an obligation on, I don't think it comes down to, it's an obligation on all. I don't think they can sort of choose as to who's going to attend. So it's that's an interesting one. The other thing
I think it's to draw attention to the fact that you have a situation on board that you're trying to manage and to alert whoever's in the vicinity or whoever's receiving that call. But yeah, this guy said on 3 occasions, calling the Coast Guard directly did not work, but the Pan on all 3 occasions got a response from the rescue vessels. It may not have been the Coast Guard each time. It might have been a military vessel.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, wasn't necessarily the Coast Guard who responded.
The other thing on the flagging is it's interesting with Australian flagging in the sense that so AMSA are what they consider a closed registry, in the sense that AMSA regulates its vessels in Australian waters and does the flagging and all the rest of it. You can get provisional flagging outside of Australia, which then eventually turns into full flagging when you come to Australia. But once you've left Australia on the vessel, AMSA that doesn't actually sort of come to your assistance when you're outside of Australia. It's like a little tiny piece of Australia which then floats off into another country, and it's the Australian embassy that comes to your assistance in those countries. AMSA doesn't, they don't have any contact outside of it, whereas other registries, for instance, Cook Island and the like, they have surveyors and contacts, and they're an open registry, and they have a worldwide presence, whereas AMSA's presence, as far as AMSA goes, is just Australia specific.
It's Area 10, isn't it? It's the Area 10 in the map. Yeah. No, what I was mentioning by that is that if you're not an Australian registered ship, then that diplomatic, the embassy responding to you, you're not entitled to. It's only if you're a registered Australian ship that you'll get that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I didn't think you could leave Australia if you weren't a registered Australian vessel, but maybe you can, according to what you're saying.
No, you're correct, Grant. You do need to have your Australian ship's registration to leave Australia. Customs will not clear you unless you have it.
Thanks, Sally, for clarifying that.
You can. So what's curious about this is that, for instance, we come across this a lot with vessels who want to register in other countries, say, for instance, Cook Island or whatever. So they're, generally speaking, they're either private vessels or they're vessels which want to go into some sort of commercial use. And the way they get around it is they then form a trust and become a corporate, and there's a corporate entity there which actually then flags the vessel as the Australian vessel, or the vessel as a Cook Island vessel. So you can get around it, but you have to have a corporation which, in essence, owns the vessel. Which is a corporation which is formed in the other country.
Yeah, Marcel, wouldn't that trigger a whole lot of taxing implications when the vessel comes back, if it's not going to stay out of Australia, and then you've got time limits before the vessel has to be taken out, or they'll reassess you for tax and tax you again on it?
If you've already paid your customs duty and your GST in Australia in terms of bringing that vessel from another country into Australia, and you've paid it, then you won't be, and then you leave and then you come back, you're not necessarily going to be taxed again in that situation.
Excellent point. You're right. Yes, good point.
But that's such a messy area of law. That's a headache. That just causes a headache.
George, did you have a comment to make?
Yes. Look, it's some people buy their yachts overseas and bring them to Australia, and I've heard them boast that they haven't required to have the Australian registration. They just arrive with an unregistered vessel. And I've had chats to the Consulate Corps about this, and they tell me unless you're an Australian registered ship, you're not entitled to the diplomatic services of your country.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just on that, it's Kev. So I've brought 2 in from overseas, and both times I've pre-registered Australian ship registration. But there is a requirement, and I only found this out in February when I came into Hobart from the Water Force guy, that you obviously get different levels of knowledge in the border force teams. And the guy was saying that if you actually imported a yacht from overseas, there is a requirement to re-export it and re-import it. There's one-page form that you fill in. So that way it negates any recurrence of GST duties. And it's basically like your ticket back into the country.
Yeah.
Now, I've gone out of the country several times and come back in without filling in that, and they didn't bat an eyelid. So, yeah.
Just depends who you get.
Yep.
How much graft you pay, Kevin?
It's the same with AMSA, and
not in this country.
With AMSA, if anybody's dealing with AMSA, take the name of the person that you speak to and have things in email, because every time you ring AMSA up, and it still happens with us, and we work a lot with them, every time we ring them, we get a different opinion.
Yeah,
excellent.
Better off to go in informed. do your research before you actually pick up the phone and talk to AMSA.
Yeah, we found that when we did the ships registration, that we could actually send all the documentation to them via email for them to look over and then come back with questions before we filed the original one. Yeah. But having said that, we didn't get our ship certificate until the night, and I kid you not, it was the night before we were about to start the race. And that was a 6-month process. And wow. The boat, we owned the boat outright. It was a brand new boat, straight from the factory, and we still had to jump all these hurdles. So yes, it is an effort and a half. If we don't have any more questions, Robin, thank you very much for putting together that presentation. Great to hear those stories, and those that haven't been overseas, we've got a fair bit of information about that Q flag and the protocol and the importance of the way you fly those flags on the mast. So, and again, Marcel's still here, so thank you again, Marcel, for being a part of tonight. And with that, I think we'll close tonight's session. It will be online for those that missed the start of it, and for that, we'll also publish it for those that couldn't make it from the international side of it. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and for us here at the Melbourne Osaka Organising Authority, we'll bid you a good night.